everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing, and very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, such as in the case of this month's guest, Jace Brittain. They were recommended to me by Paul Cunningham. So if you like this episode, go back and listen to that one, and if you liked that one, make sure you stick around for this one. Jace Brittain wrote the novel Sorcererer from Schism Neuronics in 2022 in Los Angeles, Vienna, and Salt Lake City. Their writing, poetry, and translations have been featured in Dream Pop Journal, Apartment Poetry, Snail Trail Press, Destroyer, Sleeping Fish, and elsewhere. They received their MFA at the University of Notre Dame. As a PhD candidate at the University of Utah, they study fiction, illegibility, and intersections between digital, animal, and ecological writing. In collaboration with the poet and book artist Rachel Zevitz, they run the small press Carrion Bloom Books. Before I get into my conversation with Jace, let me remind you that you can help out the show in a couple easy ways. You can become a patron at patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. For a measly $2 a month, you can get early episodes. You can also throw me a one-time donation at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe, or you can buy my book. It's called Tired. It's on Amazon. Without spending any money, you can also rate the show appropriately wherever you listen to it. You can also go on social media and tell people that the episode was good and encourage them to listen. That helps me out an awful lot as well, too. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Jace. Let's start out with talking about Sorcererer, and I'm gonna have a hell of a time saying it over and over again, but that's your book through Schism Neuronics, and it's really interesting. It's I didn't really know what to expect from it aside from having read a couple other books through Schism Neuronics. Paul Cunningham had a book out recently, and Correo had like the first one. I've read M4 Writers Interrogating the Eye, which was really good.
Yeah.
So aside from just kind of having a general idea of like what was going on, I didn't know what to expect, and as I tend to do with books I've already acquired, I skipped over the blurbs, but maybe I would have had more context. So let's talk about the book, talk about like where you got the idea from it, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And it's hard to say where the idea came from because it's was sort of an omnivorous book. More ended up going into it than I initially, whatever the initial germ was, it came to take on a lot more. So I can almost talk about different sort of genesis points. A big one that sort of shaped the physical space in the book, the sort of hospital space, was a sanatorium in Vienna called Narrenturm, which is means Fool's Tower in English, and it's now a museum, a sort of cheap, like loosely curated space. Rooms that were in the formerly of the hospital are sort of educationally tilted, but educationally as in formaldehyde jars of conjoined fetuses, severed and infected genitalia. This is where we're starting, I guess. And it was all really overwhelming. The smell of the formaldehyde was always present. But what was strange is there was like things that you might expect of this hospital that's been around since like the 15th century, as it went through phases and different head doctors who had different kind of hobby horse medical experiments they wanted to run. So, you'd go through this room that was just sort of like pure sensory overload, smell, sight. Maybe you're starting to feel a bit sick. And then the next room is all about one of the doctors who's obsessed with alchemy. And so there's like Egyptian god statues and stuff like that, and recipes for lead to gold and stuff like that. So that building, which also is nicknamed the Cake because it has a sort of like circular shape. That building became this kind of an idea into which almost anything could also go. And so that's when the hospital sort of, the hospital in the book sort of gained this ability itself to have its own transformations and metamorphoses and to sort of move around. And so that was a big spark where I think that's where it kind of became a book. I had some ideas about this protagonist who more or less was collapsed and couldn't move, and maybe believes or maybe he's turning into a snail. But they were, very just sort of centered in that spot and in that moment. And I think that this building sort of made the book into something that could contain a lot of other things as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I like that idea of I like the idea of sort of lots of different things going in at once, and that does sort of explain the construction a little bit. There's recurring characters, and each as you were talking, I was skimming the blurbs. Creo calls them prose poems. Would you agree?
The yes and no. I mean, obviously, on the cover, and I can't remember if it says it anywhere else in the book, but on the cover, I asked Gary from Schism if I could call it a novel. So sometimes it was that. I mean, it could be a novel of prose poems. I didn't think about genre a whole lot while doing it, to tell you the truth. Rhythm and sound really guided a lot of the language, and even guided the sort of plot and the I prioritized rhythm over sense mostly. So a lot of things get sort of dictated by sound. So I only thought about genre kind of at that late stage when I was editing the book for Schism. And the reason I called it a novel myself is because I actually felt like for all of the places that you could get lost in the language, for any of the sort of challenges that I left for readers or codes that I left unencoded, I felt like I was doing also some very like kind of traditional novel moves myself. And I don't know how strange that sounds given the object that is the book, but there were times where I thought, well, like I structured this in this way, and I know the novel arc. Whether sometimes when I return to this book, now it's been out for over a year, sometimes I return to it and I'm like, well, maybe not. Maybe Mike was right. But I'm not sure about the genre. I mean, I know sometimes the discrete pages, that it was more about, okay, this is a room. And, really when we're talking about anything here, it's me looking back. I'm not saying like, oh, I plotted out this novel in prose poems. It didn't come out that way. And so it's more like now I'm looking back and sort of saying, why did I do that? And trying to kind of apply language to it. So I'm truthfully not sure about the genre, but I mean, I certainly found more success submitting the pieces as prose poems than when I was calling them fiction. I think none were published as fiction. But, then a few got picked up from apartment poetry, which was great. A couple in dream pop as sort of ungenred whatevers. And so I'm also just comfortable with whatever, I'm grateful for a reader, and whatever a reader calls it, I'm genuinely interested in how it takes that shape on their end.
Right. Yeah. No, I took, it said a novel on the cover. And so I said, okay, I I will believe you. I'm a very malleable reader. Like,
Yeah.
If the book tells me it's a thing, I tend to believe it. I briefly had this idea that like sometimes I add on to the Google Doc I have about it of like mystical analysis of literature. So like a very sort of like as the reader becoming one with the text and kind of understanding the text like as its own thing, kind of beyond separation from the author, but like with a separation from the author, but a paradoxical, like as much context on the author as possible and the time in which it was written and everything, but also just the text itself. It's very sort of apophatic. You can only tell me what the book is not, sort of thing.
Yeah.
That
because I flipped over to look at Mike Correa's blurb, and I saw what jumped out to me was an occulted maze of death, and that's something that I'm completely flattered by that. And maybe if I could go back, I would call it, instead of a novel, I'd call it an occulted maze of death.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked the little touches of kind of esoterica, like hints in the section titles. Many of them have philosophia in parentheses after the title, and there's lots of sort of Latinate references to alchemy and so on, which I suppose comes from the Fool's Tower as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested. There was my German is very bad, but it's better than any other second language I have. And I noticed like a handful of German words tossed around in there. So I'm curious about your relationship with that language. I see on various places online that you do translations.
Yeah. So I studied abroad in Berlin, and then I spent a year in Vienna a few years after that. And I haven't published a ton of translations, but I've published a few. And there's a book I've been working on for a while by a Austrian poet named Franziska Fuchsel. And Franziska takes pride, I think. She's a contemporary poet, and I think she takes a bit of pride in, she might say, corrupting both my German and my English. And her book is actually literally a book of puzzles. It's called Puzzles Writ Large, which is a title she borrows from a collection of crossword puzzles. And I suppose like our connection sort of starts from a place of like both liking writing that sort of puzzles and challenges. So yeah, I translate German and lived in German-speaking countries for a bit. And this book, some of the German that survives comes from like little translation exercises I was doing for myself, or writing in German one day when the English isn't working or something like that. That kind of stuff making it in. And another kind of aspect of this like omnivorousness I was describing, I guess, is that this wasn't a main project for me. It really wasn't my sort of central project at any time. It was always a side project. And so a lot of kind of just pleasures made it in. So if I was just like messing around with the German text, or doing like working on a translation of Franziska's or something else, often it sort of made it in. And so that's partly where it comes from in this book. And then there was also the character of Oswalda is implied to have come from Germany or Austria. I don't know if it says actually in the book anymore. But at one point she was German. There's a DVD extra.
Let's see. Neither German nor Austrian appear in the book as far as control search will tell me. Okay, cool. I like that. I try to every now and again in my own writing like insert either a German title of a poem, or try to kind of think about those um, heavily compounded words, or the more I understand the grammar, the more like I feel like my sentence structure changes.
Yeah.
There's that bit in, I mean, it's kind of the whole conceit of Arrival, but there's that bit where they're like, learning new languages forces you to see the world differently, just like in the way that objects are like then sorted in your mind. Um,
Yeah, and obviously I'm like interested in that kind of play on syntax, and syntax that uh, arrives strangely or doesn't arrive. And German is a very interesting, has a very interesting syntax, different from English. And I took sign language in high school,
oh, interesting.
and that I think was like my first. That was the first sort of other language I was learning in any kind of serious way, and it's there's a bit in sign language where, especially with like active sentences, you'll place the setting and like objects within the sentence first, and then kind of get to the action. You sort of can set the stage in some sign language syntaxes, and I don't know that I remember thinking about it as that, but I remember that like we would kind of have fun trying to like write the English sentence as if it were the sign language sentence, which isn't a great way to learn the language, to say, oh, let's one for one swap the words, or sense of language in an interesting way.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then briefly, you mentioned puzzles. Something that I think I'm going through like a shift in how I want to read these days, where I've mentioned it before. Blake Butler said in an interview a long time ago that someone told him in his MFA program that it's like really beneficial to not take things super symbolically in literature, to just read. There's a moment in There Is No Year where the father walks through a door and 18 months pass in the time that he's walking through the door, and he states in this interview that it's like not a metaphor, right? It's just in the time it took to cross the threshold, somehow 18 months passed. And so I've spent years doing that for like every book that I read. And it's clear to me that that's not always the case. I think that's why whenever I see a House of Leaves Explained YouTube video, I get a little angry, irrationally. And I'm also really interested in like alternate reality games and the sort of things you can do to hide narrative. I was really inspired by various video essays about the pathologic games. And so I'm going through this sort of adjustment where I'm trying to, as I'm reading a book, decide like which end of this spectrum I've created I'm going to take. Am I going to just sort of let everything wash over me and not worry about codes or riddles or hints or whatever? Am I just going to read the text and kind of enjoy the language and enjoy the dreaminess that can come from that? Or am I going to lean more on the other spectrum where I'm trying to like looking up words I don't understand beyond just like vocab expansion, and I'm like taking notes and putting tabs in books and stuff? And I'm kind of interested like where you tend to fall on that spectrum, or if you're more movable both as a reader and as a writer.
This is a question I'm really energized by. I have a very strong resistance, even a revulsion maybe, for the phrase "just a metaphor." I would like to say nothing is just a metaphor. Um, and so I love this idea that to just read that sentence literally, a seemingly simple sentence of you walk through the door and however many years passed, and to read that literally. I mean, obviously that's such a, you know, that's such a deep well to sort of think about that and to just say that's literal. Um, I think that there's also, a pleasure in analyzing, in developing a theory, in this book, for example, like if some turn of language or some episode that was stood out from the other episodes for you caught your attention and you googled some word or phrase and it led you down an interesting path, and then you develop sort of your own narrative of something that isn't on the page, obviously there's a reason we do that is it's pleasurable. And sometimes you'll really hit on something quite true, or sometimes you'll hit on something where maybe I would say that was completely unintentional, but now I'm really interested in that too. So I guess that makes me sort of flexible. But the thing I'm really resistant to is to say anything is just a metaphor, or obviously the hospital space is meant to be an allegory here for chronic injury or for political upheaval or whatever. It's also a real place. Not within the fiction. It's a real place. I can envision the space. I can envision the characters moving through it, and that's as real to me. And that's why when I say, he either thinks he's turning into a snail or he is turning into a snail. If you really sort of hold me to the coals on that one, I say that he does turn into a snail, and he also thinks he's turning into a snail. I mean, I like irony. I like sort of contrasting or conflicting truths, and I think that those things are not so distant from what we call reality. So yeah, ultimately, I'd say that the thing that I'm most resistant to is saying something is just a metaphor.
Sure.
And I'm of course deeply fascinated with this idea of taking the opposite position and saying, no. Not only is it not just a metaphor, it's actually just literal. Because that then does something really interesting to your perspective too, right? If of all of the strange things that are possible, if you get taken one step stranger by a piece of what we call fiction, that sounds great.
Yeah. My path that took me toward whatever weird corner of literature we occupy, and various corners occupied by members of this podcast, is I was just like Googling surrealist books or surreal books, or probably even Lynchian books because it was college. Like that's how Blake Butler popped up. And so like I had this aversion. I remember I was really into Dali in like middle school and high school. Just like the first painter that ever painted anything interesting to me at that point was Salvador Dali. And my brother studied abroad in France, but they took a trip to the Czech Republic and went to a Salvador Dali museum over there. Or maybe it was just a surrealist museum, I'm not sure. And he was talking about like all the interpretations they were having, like, all the drawers and the women is because he was, he thought women were very complicated, sort of thing. And just like, but I just want a weird landscape with green women with drawers all over them. Like, I just want that to be what it is. And I had no idea about psychoanalysis and how, influential Freud was on various art movements and so on. But so like this sort of childlike escapism that had outgrown simply high fantasy and science fiction, was now just looking for like really weird stuff that I also didn't have to like worry about not being smart enough to understand. And now I'm to the point where I'm reading, people for this show, and I'm like, oh, I actually do need to be a little bit intelligent to be able to speak on some of these things. I remember Googling Mike Klein's most recent book, Ag Bog Blushy, just sort of thinking, I might as well Google it just in case. And it turns out it's a real place, and added so much more context to the work he's been doing in the past several years anyway. So yeah, there's a weirdness there. I think there's also the desire, maybe you said this as a kid a lot, but I said this a lot growing up, especially in middle school, where it's like, I like reading and I like writing, except when I have to do it for school. And so now I have this, like, if I have to do too much work for a text, then I tend to shy away from it, or force a different sort of reading onto it so that I don't have to do the work.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And there's something about reading a text that just truly immerses you in the fiction. And I find pleasure in that as well. But the kind of text that I end up holding most dearly, or maybe dearly alongside these ones that I get just completely lost and immersed in, are texts that at some point just kind of crack open for me, that either I just spend forever on some sentence that I cannot grok. There's a line in Tristram Shandy, which was a text I really struggled with when I initially had to read it for school. But there was this line about that uses this phrase lambent pupillability. And actually now I'm not sure that I could tell you, there's something about the way the characters are looking at each other in the scene, but I don't really remember even what that amounted to. But I remember I struggled over that phrase on the page it was on. And I said, okay, I'm going to crack this, or I'm going to give up on this whole book. And what I think about when I think about that book now, I mean, that phrase I have at the ready. And then I, developed affection for that book. I don't know if I actually would say I hold it most dearly, but I do remember trying so hard to just kind of crack that phrase. And then that did kind of open up avenues of reading for me. And maybe that's sort of what we're saying too, with the puzzle, that you might put together the puzzle pieces wrong, but in these books that reward that, you end up on this track where you then have a reading, right, that is yours, and then the reading experience is collaborative ultimately between in those sorts of books. And I suppose that's what I'm getting at too, now that I'm thinking about that. When I have that kind of collaborative reading experience, I then feel an intimacy with the author that ends up meaning a lot to me. And one reason I think one way surrealism endears itself to me is that it makes sense to me in what we call the real world. That there are experiences that I've had, and I love to hear about people's experiences with the paranormal, or just like even with like such extreme stress that your mind kind of paves over something, that it just doesn't make sense, and you have to kind of leave it at that. And so, that for me doesn't end up being puzzling. I suppose it's like language puzzles that wind up kind of having these collaborative experiences for me. But I'm sorry, I kind of forgot. I was trying to tuck in everything we were talking about, and I lost track a little bit.
That's okay. Welcome to my mind. That's how it always is. It's loose threads all the way down.
Yeah. I mean, that's how this book worked too.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted the character to have this like very loosely associative mind, and so we could at any point become get this book spell cast on us, and then we won't be able to talk in any kind of order or sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last half hour is just indecipherable. That would be quite remarkable, I think. I do want to touch on the snails. I have such a strong vision. One of the most like revelatory movies I've ever seen, and probably to this day one of my favorites, is A Z and Two Knots by Peter Greenaway. And the general conceit is there's a twin brothers, and oh dear, I think what it is, they each have a woman, and one of them dies in a car accident. I can't remember if the women are also twins. That feels like it should be the case. That's neither here nor there. They essentially become both obsessed with her and obsessed with decomposition. And there's a scene where one of the brothers is in this room, and it's kind of like overgrown with houseplants, and the lighting is all yellow, and there's just snails everywhere, and he's got snails all over him. And so now snails are very associated with that movie with me, and so I'm wondering where they came from for you for this book, and hoping against hope that that there's a connection there.
I haven't seen that movie, but I'm gonna watch it straight away. But I mean, for me, the snails are an animal that is common and familiar, that I've seen however many thousand snails, maybe more, in my life. And yet they're so strange to me. And I realized I didn't actually have a good sense of their anatomy or of what was where. And I didn't know if, like, is it just cartoons that convinced me that their eyes are in the antenna? I realized that, like, I couldn't speak confidently about snails, and that kind of made it make sense. And something I like is, I'll put it this way: in Kafka's Metamorphosis, there's this wonderful scene where fully a cockroach or a monstrous insect, Gregor is on the ceiling of his room, and there's this moment where he just seems to be enjoying letting his carapace hang from the ceiling and feeling the weight of his carapace hanging. And so again, I'm going to insist that the Metamorphosis is not just a metaphor, that this is a book about to some extent what it's like to be a cockroach as best as we can imagine it without the technology that grants us insight into the cockroach brain. Kafka, by sort of disavowing the kind of holds of realism and letting himself imagine to the limits of another being's consciousness, I hope got to something that's pleasurable about being a monstrous insect with a carapace. And so, that was something that I suppose was a challenge that interested me, was to imagine to the boundary, and maybe even just slightly beyond the boundary of a non-human consciousness, and especially one that seems to have so few correlations to me and my body. So the sort of collapsed Felix character, the idea that he somehow looks like a snail, however his body is contorted as he's fallen. I don't know that if you take all the language I used to describe the shape of his body, if you could actually draw it out to where it makes sense and also looks like a snail. But I like to sort of let that just shape the image you have, and then just to take time to try to imagine snailness. And I will say too that there are some great snail facts in this book. There are also some snail falsehoods. Again, I let sort of the pleasure of language sometimes take precedence over documentary truth. But there are little things like the scene where this line about just born snails having just been born eat the grapes that they came from. There was this specific like snail documentary I found on YouTube about that had a scene with this where they're born, they bust out of the egg, and then they turn around and eat the egg as their first meal. And somehow, given the mucus and the expulsions and all the ooze in my book, and the fair amount of eating as well, it felt like, oh, this National Geographic fact was granted to me, so I could have this one line referring to it. So yeah, I mean, it was just something about snails that I don't suppose I ever really answered your question, but just suffice to say that there's something about snails.
There sure is. I think that I think that that's a wonderful answer and sort of list of thoughts about this. And yeah, I did the text search for snails, so now I'm just looking at all of the other snails.
How many hits did we get for snails?
We got 40, but 3 of those were in the blurbs.
Okay.
Joelle McSweeney, unsurprisingly, brought up snails twice in her blurb, which feels right for me. A group of friends and I have done some close study on the necropastoral, and so that's very ingrained in my in any sort of like ecological reading I do. I'm the what was that Leonardo DiCaprio meme pointing at the TV anytime I see something that's necropastoral. Yeah. There it is. Great. I'm also very fascinated, and this is somehow accidentally even kind of ties into this. In the about the author, it says that in your PhD study, you study fiction, illegibility, and intersections between digital, animal, and ecological writing. Lots of words in there tickle my brain in the right way, so I wanted to make sure to ask you about like what you're doing in that realm.
Yeah, I mean, early on, just something that stood out to me, and that I was sort of thrilled that no one objected to me focusing on was nonsense, and both kind of senses of nonsense, or maybe more than both senses of nonsense. But I worked with Craig Dworkin at University of Utah, Lance Olson as well. But Craig is a good source for nonsense. You might ask him a question like, I'm looking for really sort of nonsensical poetry having to do with bark beetles. And he'll first say, well, nothing comes to mind immediately. And then he'll say, except, and then he'll give you a list of about 20 books. And so, yeah, this was something I was seeking for a long time is, who most explosively approaches nonsense as a concept or just as it appears on the page. That led me to people approaching what I called sort of non-human consciousness, but that can be animals, that can be sort of like, if you think of like Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, it can be buildings or populations of people even according to her, have a consciousness that's different from, or like not different, but not incommensurate with our own ways of thinking. And I found this wonderful documentary on slime mold that sort of just made perfect sense for the kind of nonsense I was looking for. And so that's where the sort of animals, I guess animal studies is what some people call it, kind of came in. And, that was texts approaching animals, texts trying to work through the consciousness of animals, just for me, with some resistance to, and again, this feels like similar to the resistance of the just a metaphor idea, just resistance to anthropomorphization, which felt like the easy or the instinctual way to do it. So how can you begin to kind of get at this other consciousness, or this thing that can't quite make sense to us without essentially surrendering to, well, you can't, so I'll just make them more or less human, or I'll make it just a metaphor. And the digital aspect is kind of coming from the same place in a way. Johanna Drucker, who's a book artist and a poet and a digital humanities scholar, draws a pretty straight line through, like she draws a lineage, draws a lineage from the surrealist to like a lot of contemporary digital experimental projects. And so, that's kind of where that came in for me, that there was a lot of people doing interesting experiments with digital tools that often result in nonsense, even just something as simple as a text randomizer, letting it spit out your results and then saying, where's the poem in here or not, to me is, where that comes in. Mike Klein has some great projects and just ideas in that regard. Mike Correo as well. And so those things felt very closely connected to me, which is why that very academic-y language kind of stays in my bio, because I'm just like constantly thinking about those things. And similar to you, I, Leonardo DiCaprio, point at the screen when I see a movie and there's like a scene that's sort of seems to be more deeply settled in an animal's consciousness or responsiveness or instinctiveness, like where the camera has said, we're going to just watch this bird for a minute and try to see what it sees or something. I just find that kind of desire to be very it makes sense to me to sort of want to know what not to know, but to just to wonder about, or to have questions about what kind of pleasures the snails in my front yard after it rains are seeking.
Yeah, I think that is in the same neighborhood as a lot of thoughts I have when my brain goes down certain paths about consciousness and metaphysics and things like that. I think that's kind of in the same realm. So I understand the desire. I think then. And
sorry,
go ahead, please.
I just had another thought about sort of like where that lands. So, just to say that it doesn't have to be a text that wonders, that tries to get into the snail consciousness, but you can also sort of accept the distance and the alterity of the animal or of whatever the non-human object. And I think sometimes what that looks like is like, I have a friend who did this project where she tied string to markers and hung them from a tree so that the breeze blowing through the tree traced, a pattern on a piece of paper. And that isn't to say that the tree wrote it, but kind of, yes. Mm-hmm. And it's not legible as art, but just because it's illegible doesn't mean you can't try to read it to some extent. So you could follow a snail making its little path through your front yard and try to discern what it says. And in fact, you should be quite concerned probably if it speaks to you absolutely clearly.
Yeah, that's too much responsibility, I think, for a normal person. You don't want that. That is fascinating because somebody else brought up that same example to me recently, and I cannot for the life of me remember if it was in a Discord I'm in or if it was on the show. And my brain is telling me that both are equally possible. That really has no bearing here or there, but that's interesting to me that artist has popped up a couple times very recently for me. I'm also interested in, and this is, I think, more selfishly, anytime academia comes up on this show, this is just basically me fishing for someone to say the thing that pushes me one way or the other. I've been hopelessly on the fence for years about doing more school. I talked to lots of writers who are kind of opposed to it, even if they've done it themselves. I've got people who in my life who have like actively pushed me to try to attend certain programs. I've had people tell me to apply just so I can get accepted and then not go just to because they think I need the confidence boost, and sort of all over the place. And I recently, just the other day, my wife and we went and we saw Oppenheimer, and the first section of that, when he's at the beginning of his academic career, anytime anything like that happens in a movie, it's dangerous for me because it's like, oh yeah, I could do that too. It's like watching a boxing movie or a kung fu movie, and I'm like, you know what? I should find a martial arts instructor within driving distance.
You don't realize you've made the wrong decision until you're in the ring and someone's coming at you. The
moment before the fist connects with my eye socket is when I realize. So I'm just sort of interested in, because you're online in the same sort of circles that I'm in. Your choice to pursue graduate studies and your feelings about them, I guess. Just sort of where you're at. I know you're like in the midst, so that's a perspective I haven't had yet.
So I understand resistances. I understand people who've gone partway and quit, or who finished and said never again, and I won't recommend it to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I mean, especially the MFA, for example, like for me, it was, it came at just the right time for me to go to a sort of smaller. I went to Notre Dame, and this is where I know Paul Cunningham from, and my co-editor at Carrie and Bloom, Rachel Zavix. For me, I had some ideas about writing, but I needed time, I needed space, and I needed collaboration to kind of spark my writing. I mean, I was obviously writing. I had the application materials, but I think it was a big sort of a big boost to my writing to have interactions, to have critiques, but to just be working together, to be discussing writing, and for having that be the focus for me for 2 years. I'm a very collaborative writer. A lot of material gets generated for me sort of starting in a collaborative space, not always with a living writer, or translation obviously it's easier to see where collaboration comes in there. And I didn't really know that until I had this kind of time and space and the degree of dedication that going sort of puts before you. So I know it was right for me, especially at the time. And I ended up in a program and in a cohort and with people that helped foster, I think, largely just generation and sort of positive interactions for the most part. And I can see cases depending on, you know, a different writer, a writer who needs isolation or who needs not to be told, you know, not to have their energies redirected, you know, that it wouldn't work for them. I think it's just about, you know, for me, and, you know, then continuing into the PhD, for me, it was just, to, I like having those conversations. You know, I teach, and I like having those kinds of conversations and interactions about books with, undergraduates. Obviously, it's a different dynamic there, but to some extent, and I try to be fairly transparent about that. That it's a space where you kind of put, you've come into the space. There's a, it's like you saying, sorry, I'm going to get to the sentence any second now. It's like you saying when you read the cover of the novel and it says it's a novel, you said, okay, I'm going to go in, I'll give you that much. And, you know, let's see where that goes. You know, that's like coming into the door of the classroom means these students have agreed that this is a space where we're going to talk about books or talk about their writing. And I think oftentimes that if it's done just right, obviously classrooms can not always be positive experiences, but if you kind of cultivate the right kind of community in any of these spaces, it can be a generative experience. But I'm sure one thing that other people have told you too is that obviously you're having conversations about writing.
Right.
So that might be the thing that keeps you on the fence, is that you're cruising along right on top of the fence, which is an act of acrobatic finesse.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to give me an honorary MFA, that would solve an awful lot of problems for me. I don't know.
There you go.
Don't know how we make that happen, but hit me up. I like that answer. It also seems Paul was posting about the MFA program at Notre Dame not too long ago, and I checked it out, and it looked pretty cool. For what that's worth, it did look like an interesting program. I can't do anything but a low residency program, really, with kind of how my life is at right now. Having waited until I have a wife and a kid and a house and whatever, but I'd encourage other people to try that out because that looks really cool. So let's move then into your publishing work with Carrie and Bloom Books. I want to say lately I've been having lots of thoughts about publishing, but I guess I'm kind of always thinking about it. It's just how where those thoughts are. And I recently joked, there was a fairly viral tweet about some person who got published traditionally who was encouraged to make lots and lots of TikToks, and it barely paid off. And so I was questioning what traditional publishing is even for if they're not even going to market your book. If I have to spend 60 hours a week TikToking like a 13-year-old to get my book sold, I got to do that now. I plug my book at the beginning of every podcast episode, and it still has 8 reviews on Goodreads. But it seems like Carrie and Bloom Books is a very sort of different thing. You do handbound, small edition books, and they look really beautiful. And you've kind of been on my radar for that for a while, but I'm interested at the sort of how that got started and why this kind of format for publishing.
Yeah, so it emerged on a drive. My partner and I and co-editor Rachel Zavix, we had both worked for a couple journals where we were editors, and we, in a very real sense, had the say, but felt like we didn't feel like it was our thing, and that some of the work we were publishing, we were consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously taking into account the entity that we were working under or the other editors or something. And so this was, wanting to kind of be the sort of shaping force, and also um, knowing without even trying to think that hard of a number of texts by friends or friends of friends or just poets that we were aware of that either had a long, difficult journey to get published or were unpublished because they couldn't find a home. And these were writers that were like, we know they're amazing. We know this book, and like we could just put it out. And so that was, that was kind of the push, is just knowing that the work was there. And that has something that is still so apparently true. The 2 times that we've done open submissions, and most of the work we've published has been from so far has been from just our first call. And in our first call we said yes to 6 things, which was a lot for the way we do it, but there were so many more, and in the call we're almost done reading for now. There's so much amazing work, and so many books that we published from that first call, where the author said, yeah, this, I didn't know that this would ever get published. I've been sending this around forever. And these were books that, like, we, when we reach out to them, we're like, oh, we love this book. We're desperate for it. We know you probably have a bunch of, people banging on your door to publish this experimental play in verse chapbook. And, but we want it. And they're just like, no, it's just you, but you can have it. And so, part of it is just, we want to create, to work with the authors and help these books that we find like truly mesmerizing or shocking or just pleasurable to help them find their sort of ideal form. And the University of Utah, this is one fortunate thing about us having gone there that we didn't really know beforehand, is it has an incredible book arts program. My partner has gotten a full certificate in addition to what she's doing academically in book arts. So she is a real talent. She's honestly a visionary talent as a book artist, and it was something she only discovered in the last 6 years, that she just can kind of imagine the shape a book could take. And she's studied all these forms, and obviously that helps, but I think she has a real knack for it. And so that became the other part of it, that we want to form these books ourselves. And so the small edition thing is just a side effect of that we can only do so many. And I mean, it's resulted in this editorial experience of, we touch every page. We have a close, like, sort of physical and editorial proximity to these texts. So the process does, for me, end up feeling, quite collaborative on each of these books we've done. We really feel that we are kind of creating a community of really some quite strange books. And it is encouraging to look and see some of the other presses kind of cultivating similarly. I love the word unshapely in contrast to this book that I read praising like shapely writing. So I like to look out and see the inside the castles, the ugly ducklings, the apocalypse party, 1111 sublunaries that are sort of have these like stable of writers creating unshapely oeuvres, translations, plays in verse, all sorts of things. And we're glad that we can provide an avenue for some of these books to come into the real world and get readers and be in conversation with our other books. That's really been the total joy of this process.
Yeah, absolutely. While you were talking, I was looking through the photos of the books, and the binding on some of them was just so pretty.
Yeah.
That's a very sort of lower, a silly response to everything you said, but
No, not
particularly,
not at all. I mean,
like wow. I very much appreciate the that I think there's something to the handmade aspect that I think you expressed really well, and there's a part of me who's always, I think what it is that I tend to to shy away from scarcity when it comes to books. I get nervous about it, and like it says like right on your on the website that if you want something that's sold out, just email us. So like, it's not like I'm worried about the work itself disappearing.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a dissonance there with me where I just like, I want everybody to be able to like hold the book object in their hand. I'm such a physical media guy, but at the same time, like there's something really special about receiving a handmade little book from somebody, especially like in this ecosystem where you might only need to make 50 copies of a book ever anyway.
Yeah.
So part of it's a little like foolish on my part, thinking every single book is right about to blow up. But yeah,
I have the same thing.
Do you?
Where where I'm just like, oh, I'm so excited about this thing. Surely I'm, only one of an anonymous horde trying to get this chapbook, and I'll sort of do it, seek these things out in like a total like panic, thinking that it's running low, and then then you can see however many weeks later that it's still available or something like that. But I mean that is another part, especially on Rachel's side. She's written really eloquently about the powers of the book object. And I think for her, there's this sort of artist book world where sometimes they're like extremely limited editions, like 10 copies or something like that, and they're the prices are much higher than you would think to pay for a chapbook of poetry. So we liked the artist book as this object that gets all this time dedicated to it and care in each stitch, and that each stitch is has something to say about the book. It's not just a set dressing for then the real text is inside. We think about how these books are going to be shaped and what form best suits them, especially for a couple projects we have coming up. But we also want to make that, maybe more accessible, or, to get a wider readership. We try to keep it a little bit cheaper. And then, people can get these digital versions free that, I don't think, like you said, there's something to holding the physical object, but, we want these things to be available. We want them to be read, but we also we just enjoy, we're obsessed by paper. So we want to enjoy the feeling of the paper. We like sewing, and so we have affection for the physical objects. We want them to be as widely available as possible as well. So those are kind of like maybe opposing drives that we try to kind of find the most, even the nearly impossible solution to accessibility and then this like level of working out the shape the book wants to take. And I think so far it's worked out, and I think that like the authors we've worked with have appreciated that degree of dedication, even if sometimes even sometimes 50 copies can feel like a lot if it's a particularly challenging book. But we almost always want to do more. I'll be reading from Sorcererer. I'm going to read a few selections. One thing about this book is it's sort of obsessively titled, and the titles sort of have a running narrative that is sometimes counter, sometimes overlapping, sometimes signal versus noise, against or with or beside the text. So I usually try to do something about tuning with those when I perform. So you'll hear that and hear the titles as I go. So you'll get maybe a sense of the narrative here, or just a sense of the nonsense. Conundrum, 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 all dried up or drying up and crying, only the sound of tears not falling. What luck, what lousy wrung luck. In this heat they said don't start with the weather, that's all there is for some folks like him. When Felix understands something, he doesn't believe it. A practice. I submit to the cannibals I'm becoming. I submit to the cannibals I'm becoming. I submit to the cannibals I'm becoming. The cannibals I'm becoming. A near certainty Felix fell, fallen still, against a current situation in which he could only guess that somehow he had lost his elasticity and collapsed after one violent expectoration. Poor me, thought Felix, now scrunched up, ass up, with little motor control, drooling, dirty, bloody face down on the cracked pavement in the sun, thinking about snails. How snails looked, how snails had looked, when he had had them inching all over his chest, a desperate and failed cure for what ails him, a failed cure, since, really, they had been eating him alive, hadn't they? Fantasies in which I'm trod upon, fantasies in which I'm trod upon, the expectoratus being not far above where his nose smished into the path which led to the Menlo sanatorium. He could see it, that which he had expectorated in black and blood, and the horrible heaving which coaxed it up from within him and had robbed him of his stuffing strength and fibers, and drawn him into this collapsed pile so down, so low. Oh, now he was mixed up, turned around. Must have been, since the expectorated slime was inching uphill toward him. Then, no, facing this path this way, away, so that way must lead to the grove of pathetic thin trees with leaves that could dull a bitter metallic mouth, if chewed. See, this was downhill after all. Vex hex rex, vex hex rex, vex hex rex. As is often with runaway thoughts, the tracks led to a sweet-minded friend. Between dear Oswalda and Felix, other than an affable affection and suffering's unanimity, and the accidentally neighborly exchange of one's cloudy molecules, there was the codes, guttered or encircled or ciphered letters in the books which they loved in the Menlo Respiratory Sanatorium's library. The conditions of the shelves and their contents left something to be desired, but what put those statics off allowed the zeroed pair wider quietude in their turns. Disquietus, the secret exchange had accumulated in palimpsestual volumes unnoticed in the sanatorium library. Well-inked say-so over and through the other words the text communicated, or subbed equivalents, noise for message. crossed and tabbed teaked shelves, and prying from them the familiar volumes nobody else might have interest for, a gesture made outmoded by the illegibility of the marks that had been bound to the crooked spines of this or the other opusculum on duck husbandry, polite death, and poetry, since who had the time, or the green growing eats the edges of the pages, while dark slime from the every letter's core. Oh, Felix, a self sobs, why wrestle with the enciphermentous toil, except and only to perform the precise toil they expect again and until you've nothing to hide, nowhere to hide it, and nothing to hide, and nowhere to hide it. What a picture, thinks again Felix, so curled up now, bald and bawling and falling and failing to crawl, bleeding or blood in mouth just seeping out corners, recently expelled burgundy black slime, spattered, spittled, so that string of saliva connecting the slime still gooing from lips. Knees buckled under, face to cracked pavement of the path across and around the Menlo grounds. Alchemia too. The snails, those tracers that had taken the time plotting out their own graveyard on Felix's chest, a cure, a guess, an unaimed prayer, a slow mutilation. The living division of the alchemic grocery list, the beast slow and slovenly feeding on him, sticky pads almost invisible except to the readers, the mages, the white coat sages quacking around his strapped down gurney bed, eaten alive and neither the last nor the least of it. The vague question then being one of cannibalization, answered in infinite loop of sputtering and gross slime. Become snail, ya eats what ya are. Transformation isn't very becoming, Felix thought, then farted. I said static is noise, and I said static is movement, and I said static is stillness. I said static is noise, and eat, say. There are many regrettable sentences to return to the source. Eat, say, everything regurgitated is gold. Don't be what's gnawing inside out. Don't be shell-chunked nothing or nothing at all. If they ever find my dirty picture, which I took of Owen Wister, the West will be unwon. His vomit dreams then, or perhaps in an amalgamation of its many selved and celled visions of every meal that has activated their hum, gotten a rise out of their so-to-speaks, and then every meal they've become in the process. Oh, gods, everything is alive, Felix thinks, in sharing this vision with those he has expelled. Can a snail dream itself a moth, or must those images unveil more slowly than that? Equivalence, equivalence, messages of constant noise, meanings of constant message, systems of constant meanings, constant noise, unending systems, any one from which the code can be derived. The order of the jar and splendors accepts, rejects, and therein performs. Dreamt as mountain 1 through 5. Dreamt as mountain I through V. Dreamt as mountain I. The degree to which isolation and seclusion aren't synonyms. The songbirds of pre-dawn aren't politically suspect, but as some person starts a gramophone to sing, Felix rushes his eyes to form and drags uphill. The record loses steam before, and soon in silence the same light burns and exposes invisible streams from clinging packets of snow, pathetic thin ice barely covering the absent puddle already slipped from, cadaverous the piles that hope to be flowers reveling in cold mud. Elevation which returns to him something that. The crackling paper of that thin ice, the foot and the crackle they make among the trees' ghastly sentinels, so Felix too from here down on the sanatorium as a dollhouse, the others even more diminutive. That wine in the air, again, breathes Felix. Clean, cold, pure, toxic, cursed, stinging, insufficiently respiratory, just what I. A deep breath of evil, tomorrow crisp, healthy, restorative, lift a piano above my head, mighty toss the record player into the canyon, clattering pathetic horn of a downed and false herald. Don't shoot the is maybe only after, so don't shoot the messenger later. rotting clarion dissected in equity by this mountain scavenger democratic chaos cult, detritivores learning the tune, inheriting the wonders of the moldering folds and reeds, discords, unflattering, untraceable dissolution. We should all be so, even eat so, lucky. Other spring, other mountain, the building, coiling long hallways tight, unlike the statics tell her the circle in the dew cold grass and the clapping and song, but Oz won't believe in the discovery of kindness. She won't believe in the discovery of kindness. Also, Oz recalled how easy for some to find kindness out here, involved, out under the hidden, deeply ecstatic she knows to be cruel laughs and claps and shares a spectacular gesture, and how easy to lose one's eyes in that swirl of limbs and free command to some childhood melody. Oz from a grassy edge lifts gossamer ice, so careful, or it softly shatters. Or with fortune wetly drapes a virgin shroud over her hand, melts as a death mask, and she lies down out and under. The mist too, and everything is gauze, yes, to be disembarrassed of life. Citing the fiduciary, but what they can abide is joyful disembarkment. Let me die, Oz screams as. Like a hospital, the hospital slides discreetly from the hills and toward the sea. All gross abatements begin at the haruspexus. And lastly, encoded, a short-billed one or two, new, accenthisic eclipsing plumage, CF:, a feather enclosed at considerable risk.